Hello, and welcome to Note-Taking from Lectures and Reading. My name is Ruth Silverman, and I'm a Learning Services Coordinator at the Student Learning Commons. I wanted to give a reminder that the Student Learning Commons is located on ancestral and unceded Coast Salish lands. The Musqueam, Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, Cutsey, and Coquitlam people on the Burnaby campus. Musqueam and Squamish on the Vancouver campus. And on the Surrey campus, it's the Kakite, Kwantlen, Semiahmoo, and Tsawwassen peoples. This presentation is going to cover the purpose of note-taking, taking notes from lectures, taking notes when reading, possible formats of notes, how to get the most from your notes, and introducing some of the services and resources that we provide at the Student Learning Commons. So I often ask students what they think the purpose of note-taking is. And sometimes they talk about trying to get everything down on paper. And I would argue that that's not really the purpose of note-taking. That's kind of transcription, really. And sometimes it interferes with the student being able to listen in lecture, their ability to select main points if they're just writing everything down. I would suggest that that's not the purpose of note-taking. In contrast, these are some of the purposes of note-taking. It's pretty comprehensive when you talk about note-taking for lectures, but for readings, there are additional purposes that we will get to later. So it's basically to summarize key ideas that are presented. And if you're going to summarize key ideas, first you have to identify what are the key ideas and try to distinguish them from minor details or perhaps just the professor going off topic. So you're processing the information. You're not just transcribing. You're thinking about, how essential is this piece of information? Is it important enough to write down? It's serving as a memory cue when you go to review your notes, when you're studying for your exams. So it doesn't replace memory. So students who just review by rereading, that's almost like a false sense of security going into an exam. Basically, it's better to use your notes, maybe a heading in your notes or a highlighted word as a cue to try to remember the rest of it when you're studying. Note-taking helps you process or engage with the material. It's something active that you can do in lecture rather than just, possibly tuning out or using other media on your laptop or something like that. If you're taking notes, you tend to focus better. And it's a way of zeroing in on connections and relationships between material. It's good if you're already thinking about, how does this new material coming in relate to something that I already know? It's even better if you can think about those connections within the class. So if, for example, you're taking notes and the material is reminding you of something in an earlier unit, that's worth noting down because often you'll be tested on the relationship between concepts from different parts of the course. But even if the information is just connecting with material you learned in earlier classes, that's going to make it easier for you to learn, make it more memorable. If it's connecting with something personal in your life, like if you're learning about some sort of health condition that someone in your family has had, or something of that nature, or if it reminds you of current events because you're studying economics or political science, that makes it more memorable for your learning as well. So that's worth noting down. And the final point is that taking notes will help you develop your note-taking skills. In a way, it sounds self-evident, but I have had students say that they don't take notes in lecture, or they don't take notes from readings, and they just say, I'm not good at taking notes. Like, your ability to take notes is something innate. And if you're not born with the inherent note-taking ability, then you might as well just give up. Um, I would say, that is wrong thinking. It's like any skill that you're practicing in university or in your life is something that can improve with practice. For some people, maybe it takes more effort. Maybe it takes some help seeking for it to improve in practice. Maybe that's why you're here, seeking help about your note-taking. But eventually, if you practice and you use correct strategies, and you think about what you're doing and make adjustments if what you're doing isn't working, then you will get better at note-taking. So we're first going to talk about note-taking from lecture, but of course it's connected with your readings as well. And sometimes students wonder, do I read first? Do I go to lecture first? A lot of professors will emphasize coming to class prepared, having read the material, but sometimes students question that. Is it really necessary? And the answer is it depends, just like the answer in so many things in university. So sometimes a student will complain about lectures like sort of flying by them too quickly, and they can't really grasp what's going on, and they don't really understand some of the vocabulary, and that interferes with their understanding of what the professor is saying. Or, maybe it's hard to focus during lecture. If that's you, then definitely you want to do the reading first and take a good set of notes. And the reason for that is that you can't control the pace of a lecture, but you can control the pace at which you do the reading. If you're, doing a piece of reading, you can spend the time that you need to fully understand it and to grasp the main points and everything, even if it's long and tedious, but you can make that time for yourself. Whereas in lecture, you don't have that chance. So you can't like flip the page back and hear again what the professor said before, unless you're listening to a lecture recording. So I do recommend in that case doing the reading before lecture. In some cases, the professor is a very clear lecturer. It's easy to grasp the points. It's easy to maintain your interest. But maybe the textbook is hard to understand. And in that case, I would say, it might be better to go to the lecture first and then do the full reading after the lecture with your lecture notes in hand to help you interpret the book. But even in that case, I would say to take a stab at the book first so that you feel like you have some sort of preparation mentally to go into the lecture. Like at least read the introduction and conclusion. If there's any questions at the end of the chapter, look at what the questions are so that can guide what you're trying to take out of the lecture. Look at any bolded words of vocabulary and look up what they are. Any pictures, like just kind of flip through what you need to read, even if you don't think you will understand it until you've gone to the lecture. So this brings up a good point. One of the reasons that I'm saying is that you should at least look at certain things in your readings before going to class, is that that's one way to be prepared to take good notes. You're going to better be able to grasp what's coming at you if, for example, you're already familiar with the vocabulary that's used. So other ways of preparing are going through the syllabus, taking a look at what topic is going to be covered in the lecture, if there are any learning objectives for that topic that are listed in the syllabus, or if the professor has handed out like discussion questions or anything like that beforehand. then you want to look at that as well. It can help to look at your notes from the previous class because the next class might build on it. So these are some tangible things that you can do. But the other thing you can do is just make sure you get a good night's sleep, because arriving to class not well rested, you're less likely to be able to focus on what's going on. It's still worth coming to class, but you'd get a lot more out of it if you're well rested. And what does well rested mean for university age students? It probably means more sleep on a regular basis than you would think. So there's been research on this, and it shows that typical university age students, like around 17 to 24, need more than 8 hours of sleep a night. So like maybe about 8.5 to 9.25 hours are optimal for students at that age. And there's also been more research to show that students who get that amount of sleep are tending to do a lot better academically than those who don't. So one thing that students will do is sometimes have up to 3 sets of notes for the same information. And then it makes it, harder, it makes it more effortful to take the notes, and it makes it harder to condense information for when you're studying. So what I would suggest is really having one set of notes per topic. So assuming you do the reading first, you would take notes while you're doing the reading, and you would leave some space to add to your notes from what you hear in the lecture. You'd actually kind of bring the notes to the lecture and, maybe follow them along to the extent that you have things written in, and just adding little bits and pieces here or there. Like maybe the professor gave a different example or something like that. There would be room for you to add. And that really gets away from the problem that students have where they're having trouble taking notes and listening at the same time. If you have a set of notes going into the class, it enables you to focus more fully on what the professor is saying. An even better situation is if the professor provides lecture slides or lecture notes online before the class. And in that case, you can print them out, ideally, or maybe, have them in a document that you can add to. But say you print them out, then you can add your reading notes to them and add your lecture notes to them as well. And if you go to the lecture first, then you just kind of reverse the process. You would take your lecture notes, maybe on the professor's slides if those are provided, and then you'd leave some room to add further details from your readings. That also, in addition to making taking notes less distracting and less effortful during lecture, it can also cut down on the time that it takes to take notes while reading if you already have a set of notes going in, be they notes from a professor's slides or notes from the actual lecture. So here's a question. Do you tend to take notes by typing or by writing? That's something that's important to consider. A lot of the time, students will bring in their laptops and they will be typing their notes. There are obvious issues with that. You can, very easily get distracted if the professor seems to be talking about something that's not terribly important or terribly interesting. It's very easy to navigate and look at something else and kind of get lost in that something else and miss some very important points. But even leaving that aside, there's a question of, okay, like I can focus whether I take notes on my laptop or by pen, pen on and paper, or like pen on a tablet or something like that. But does one work better than the other? So often I will ask this question in class or in workshops, and students will say, I like to take notes on my laptop better because I can type faster than I can write. So at this point, I'm going to stop and take you back to the purpose of note-taking. So if the purpose of note-taking is not necessarily to get everything down, and it's to identify and summarize key concepts, serve as a memory cue, help you engage with the material and make connections, is it really important to get more down by typing instead of by writing? The research actually demonstrates that in addition to the distraction factor, writing your notes is superior, in fact, because what you think will be an asset, the ability to type fast, actually turns out to be a disadvantage. Because sometimes people will type so fast that they really are literally transcribing. Like the material is going into their ears and it's going down their arms to their fingers and completely bypassing their brain. If you're a really fast typist, you don't really have to process the information as it's going in. You just kind of focus on typing. So really, you're not learning anything from the lecture itself. And your learning is entirely dependent on being able to like go back and reread your notes, maybe sometimes rewrite your notes, and process the information then. So what I'm asking is, why delay the processing of information? It causes more time being spent later. So the research shows that students who take notes by hand actually retain and understand more. And this is one of the studies that speaks to that. And the reason is that it is slow and effortful to take notes by handwriting. So your brain is going to automatically listen to the material that's coming in and try to identify what are the main points, like what needs to, do I really need to write this material down? Or is it sort of secondary and I don't need to write it down? And if you do identify it as a key point that you need to write down, then the next question is, can I write it down in fewer words? So right away, you're not just trying to remember the information, you are trying to understand it, because if you can put it into other words, that means you're understanding it. So students who write down their notes for those reasons tend to learn more from the actual lecture. If you're typing the notes, it would probably serve you well to kind of pause and ask those sorts of questions like, is this important enough to type? Can I reword it? Yeah, and then definitely it's very important to go back and review your notes. So when I encourage people to handwrite their notes, a lot of students are worried about missing things and not getting things down. But let's go back to the purpose of note-taking again. Does it really matter if you miss things? You're not trying to make a word-by-word record. You were trying to get down some main points and maybe like take notes on connections that you're noticing. So, that's not as big a deal. And also, going back to an earlier slide, if you already have a set of notes that you're just adding to in the lecture, then it really doesn't matter if you miss things either. But if you are worried about missing things, then, maybe just go out in the 10 minutes between classes and review your notes. Because like say you didn't quite finish a sentence, you left some words off of a sentence, you're probably going to remember what those words are. And even better, if you review your notes after class with a classmate, then you'll be able to help each other fill in any gaps. And if there are things that you don't understand, You can, indicate that. You can try to fill the gap later from your readings or by going to a professor or TA. And if you're reviewing with a classmate, you could maybe both go to the professor or TA together if there's something you both don't understand. Yeah. So how do you know if something is a main point, or important enough to write in? If you have done the reading first, or if you've prepared from looking at your syllabus or review questions, those will really help guide you into what are the most important key points. There are also some things you could tune into during the lecture, one of them being what I said already about if information connects to other information in the course, then that's likely to be pretty important. Here's some other things to look at. Sometimes the professor will totally just give it away and say, this would make a good exam question or something like that. Sometimes what they're doing would give it away if they all of a sudden seem to become pretty animated and start speaking faster or louder or gesturing more, moving around, making lists. I mean, anytime they think it's important enough to show a slide with a list or numbers, then that often can be quite important. So let's turn our attention now to taking notes from readings. There's a really good video on this topic from the University of North Carolina Learning Center. And I suggest that you scan the QR code and watch the video, which you see is only 3 minutes and 46 seconds long. It goes into the basics. And one of the basics that it goes into, like I'd say one of the most important points, is that it's not just about taking the notes, it's about reading in such a way as to identify the key points and make them memorable in the first place, as well as reading in such a way as to maintain your focus. So an important method to remember is the 3R method of reading. And the 3R method stands for read, recite, record. So what you want to do is read in short intervals of 1 to 2 paragraphs at a time. Why am I saying that? Have you ever had the experience that I've had many times of reading an academic textbook or an article and getting pretty far into it, maybe read a few pages and all of a sudden realize that you didn't process anything that you read. You can't remember it because your mind was on something else. Your eyes were moving over the words, you were turning the pages, nothing was going in. And if you have to keep backtracking several pages, it's a complete waste of time. So just read a little short piece. And after you've read that little short piece, look away. And the recite part is trying to say aloud the main points of what you just read. Ideally, you're saying it out loud so that the material can go into your ears as well as your eyes. So you'd be learning it more strongly. But if you're in a silent study area, you could just try to say in your head the main points of what you just read. And it will naturally cut down the amount that you want to take notes on, because you're not going to be reciting the entire paragraph. If you can't have a summary or a paraphrase of what you just read, then it cues you that you need to reread that paragraph. But at that point, it's just that paragraph. And after you have, sort of said the essence of what was in the paragraph, that's what you write down, because you're naturally condensing it by saying it out loud first. I used to mostly take notes by highlighting and then maybe writing annotations in my textbook. And that's not a bad method of note-taking. Some students will sit in their lecture with their textbook and write in the margins. That's okay. But the way that I was doing it is I was just highlighting as soon as I'd read something. And when you've just read something, everything looks important. If you read a paragraph and then you look away and you try to say the essence of it, that'll cut down on what you're highlighting or what you need to write down if you're taking notes by writing things down. And you definitely want to be selective in what you write down. You want to write down just key points and supporting points. You don't want to have notes that are longer than the source material that you just read. I mean, what student has the time for that? And what student has the time to study that when you're preparing for a test? Not only do you not have the time to study that, but the extraneous, more minor information will distract you when you're studying. So if you are going to be highlighting, just do like maybe keywords or key phrase. And when you go back to review, just look at the highlighted words and use them as a way to try to remember everything associated with, or like use the highlighted word as a question, like, what does this mean? How does this word connect to this other word, as a way of self-testing? Because one way to use your notes, I think I mentioned this before, to prepare for tests is use them more as memory cues rather than just reading them verbatim as you're studying. Because what do you have to do on a test? You don't have to read things on a test. I mean, other than reading the questions or maybe reading a brief passage or description, you're answering questions. And for the most part, you're answering questions from memory. So you need to practice that memory skill. What about if you're not reading for a test? What if you're, doing a bunch of readings towards writing a paper or preparing for a class discussion, or preparing a presentation or that kind of thing? That means that you're supposed to be taking a critical lens on what you're learning and contributing some of your own points and your own thoughts on the material. And also drawing those connections explicitly between different materials that you have read. So previously, when we were talking about lectures, or we were talking about note-taking from readings, if you're just writing a test on it, it's more of making a record of the key points of what are said. If you're going to be writing, say an argumentative paper, though, then you want to take notes not just on what is said in the source, but in the thoughts that you have. So a good format was presented by Western Sydney University, and you can get the full, much more complicated version if you scan this QR code, is just making a 3-column table, with the first column being the full citation of the source that you're reading, so that you don't lose track of that. And the second column, you take the notes of the main points, what the source says, and you can use the 3R method, just like I described for that. If the source is making an argument, you want to, write down what the source is saying, what is the main argument, and what are the pieces of evidence that they're using. And you might want to put some quotes with quotation marks or page numbers, but you're definitely would be using quotes very sparingly in what you're writing, so you wouldn't always write down any quotes. And then reflect on what you've read. I mean, you could, I don't know if you want to stop after every paragraph or two to reflect. There might not be enough there, but if you're stopping after every paragraph or two to get down the points, maybe stop after every section of what you're reading, if there's like a subheading or something, and just kind of reflect on what was said and see if you have any thoughts and take a note of those thoughts. The most important thing to put in the third column is how you're planning to use this source in your paper. Like this will back up my, my second point of my paper or something like that. What questions do you have about what is said? Like the question can be, how did they come to that? Like, I don't really understand. Does this really follow? But it could also just be, this raises an interesting question and I want to find other sources that address that question. Make a note of points that you agree or disagree with. You might think that the author is making an assumption or something like that. That's worth noting. I'm not just talking about like emotionally agree or disagree. I'm talking about if there are like rational reasons why you might disagree with something because of other things that or because you're noticing a flaw in how the argument is laid out, which is why I'm saying like make a note of the argument and the evidence for it. Where you're noticing a connection, like a, compare or a contrast with another source, noted in that column. Talk about the strengths and weaknesses that are found in that source. So your reflections there, taken together are going to lead to a much stronger paper and kind of less legwork to do when you actually go to the outlining and writing phase of your paper. Here's another template for taking notes to ask those kinds of questions. And if you go to that QR code, you will actually get a brochure all about critical reading and note-taking from Queen's University of Belfast in Northern Ireland. And page 4 of it is, it's a PDF, so the ability to copy is maybe a bit limited, but there's kind of a page template that you can use if it's easier for you to take notes for writing critical analysis kind of pieces using a really strict template rather than the 3-column method. So this brings us to the question in general of formats for note-taking, so whether you're taking notes for critical reading or not. You can even, different ways to use different formats, like for lecture, for reading, for review. So the first one is the comparison chart format that I've shown above. And that's a great format if you're, going to be asked to compare, contrast different things later. So here is a theory course. Anytime you have a theory course, a comparison chart can be your best friend, where you list the theorists on one dimension and the various aspects that the theories address on the other dimension. If you have an Excel table, you can maybe summarize a whole theory course in an Excel table, which is a really good study aid. So probably in that case, it's a better, way of making review notes than actually sitting there in class or while you're doing individual readings. Yeah, and another example would be, say it's a literature course. You're often asked to read, say a few different novels and compare the novels on things like theme and setting and characters and that kind of thing. So table is a really good review note method for making connections. But sometimes, you might be just sitting in lecture and the professor is presenting some things that can be compared and contrasted easily. You can just jot down a rudimentary table. Another way of showing relationships in your notes is concept mapping. And again, if you have a large enough concept map, you can show the relationships between an entire course in your review. But it's also actually a really quick method of note taking. So students who get proficient on concept mapping, it's a tool where they can, write down things fairly quickly when they're reading or when they're in lecture, and it can be quite efficient. You do have to, like, since it's very sketchy with just words here and there, you always have to make a point of reviewing it so that you know what exactly you're talking about. I'm sorry, I forgot to make a QR code for this, but there is a URL at the bottom. It's from the University of North Carolina. And if you want to learn more about making concept maps, that is a good source. Cornell notes are a really good method of note-taking. The purpose of Cornell notes wouldn't exactly be the same. It's not necessarily for relationships, but it's a really good one for testing yourself. So what you would do is during the lecture, you could also do this for your reading notes. You would divide up your page or, your Word document or whatever, and you would write your notes in the larger part. And then when you're reviewing your notes after the lecture, you would go back and you would write your keywords or any questions in the margin that relate to the main body of notes. And that would be the column that you would look at when you're reviewing the notes. You would look at that column, you would try to remember what's in the notes. And if you can't remember it, then you have a very easy reference. Also, if you try to get somebody to quiz you, like, it's a very good tool, because you can give it to your mom or dad or, whoever, even if they don't know anything about the course, and you can just say, like, ask me these questions that are in the margin. So it's a useful study tool. On the bottom, it says write a short summary of the lecture. And that wouldn't necessarily be on every page, but after you're reviewing after the first class, you can just write, the really key points there to keep you on track about what's important in that section of the course. Okay, so say you have these really excellent, useful notes by following all these other tips in this session. How do you get the most of them? I used to take really great notes in my lectures, and they wouldn't be organized. Like, I would just, I didn't want to schlep around all my binders. So I would have my notes here and there on clipboards or whatever. And I'd go to study and I wouldn't be able to find all my notes, or I'd find them all crumpled up or something. So keep them organized from the get-go, so, like, have them in a binder, make a point every day, if you're not taking your binders to school, to, immediately as soon as you go home, take out your notes and put them in the binder. Similarly, if you're taking notes virtually, like on a computer or something, always file them in a folder immediately after. Have dedicated folders for all your courses, have, subfolders for different topics in your courses, just some organization, a few minutes from the get-go will save you a lot of grief later on. If you do prefer to take notes by hand on paper, one thing I started to do because of that tendency is I would buy these, like, really thin, light notebooks. And I'd have a notebook for each course and, just take it around. And actually they would be very thin, so not heavy. And I'd usually have a few notebooks, over the course of a term per course. But it kept everything in one place. And that was useful. The other thing to make the most of your notes, which is another thing I didn't do when I was in university, is the review. So periodically, I've been mentioning, like, reviewing your notes from memory, maybe using the Q column in Cornell notes and that kind of thing. You do want to do that periodically. I used to be on the black curve, the solid black line, when I was in university. So here I am at the top. That means I just did a piece of reading, or I just was in a lecture and I know 100% of whatever it was that I learned during that time. So what I would do then is I'd probably lose the notes, but let's say I put them away. I would put them away. I wouldn't look at them again until about a month later when the first exam was coming up. And I very quickly had forgotten most of it, so if you don't look at your notes between when you took them and between when the test is coming up, you might know like 5% or something. I mean, I've had the experience of looking at a page of notes being like, did I write that down? And that's not good, because then you think you're studying for the test, which is in, maybe a couple of days, but you're actually having to relearn all of this. You're bridging this huge gap in terms of your knowledge. So that's why you think, oh, it's not going to take very long to study this, and it takes a hugely long time, and you might run out of time. Notice that a big part of the drop-off happens within the first 24 hours. And the reason is that you haven't put that information into your long-term memory. How do you put that information into your long-term memory? By doing an initial review within 24 hours. That will, signal to your brain that this is important and you should actually put it in your good files. So you do that, and then your memory will rebound quite a bit. If you keep reviewing your notes periodically throughout the term, and we say periodically, maybe every week, every 10 days, you just pull out all your notes and go through them. You're always hovering between about 80 and 100% memory. And you get to day 30 where the test is coming up and you pretty much remember everything. You might have to refresh a little bit, and then you can start working on applying the material to questions, which is really good preparation for a test. So memory is kind of taken care of. So a lot of people will say, well, I don't have time for that at all. I can't review all of my notes every, 10 days or so. It's impossible. But I do want to remind you that the more you review, the more familiar you get. And eventually, you'll just basically be flipping through, like, say you're reviewing by looking at keywords that you've highlighted. At first, you might have to read the explanatory information. And then once you've reviewed a few times, it's like, no, it's like, I read a highlighted word, everything comes back. I read another highlighted word, everything floods back. And it just might take a couple of minutes. So it's not a huge investment of time. Plus, if we really back up and you are taking notes the way that we've talked about, by, say, using the 3R method when you're reading, by being prepared for lecture, so you've done your readings and you're just kind of adding to your notes and you're able to focus because you're not madly trying to get everything down. You're writing your notes, so you're actually processing the information as it comes in. Then the task for you to keep the information in your head is going to be a much lighter task anyhow, because you've been actively processing that material since day one, since you were first at the lecture and since you were first doing the readings. So that's about it for reading and note-taking. If you want more about either of those topics or many more topics, go to the Student Learning Commons website and go to this orange tab that says Learning and Studying. There are a number of other topics listed, each with a ton of resources that elaborate on what I said. This workshop is recorded, and you would have find a workshop, and it would be linked from there. There are a lot of other workshops that are recorded that are linked from there as well, such as one about getting the most from lectures, where I go into more detail about how to get the most from lectures. And the other one here is book a consultation. So if you're an SFU student, you can actually make an appointment at this link to meet with a more advanced student individually. And it's free, and you can talk about your particular note-taking questions or really anything. I mean, you can bring in a paper that you want help with. You can talk about exam preparation strategies or time management strategies. The time will be yours. And I wanted to show you that as I'm presenting this now, which is in May 2023, and probably for a fair time after this, you can get prizes for attending SLC consultations or workshops. If you're watching this, you can make a note right now that you watched this on this date. When you are next at Burnaby or Surrey campuses, you could drop by the Student Learning Commons and pick up a stamp card. And you basically need 4 stamps, which is like a consultation, a workshop, watching a recorded workshop, English conversation partner, just, our various things you can do with the SLC. Once you get 4 stamps, then you can get a prize. So I encourage you to do that, and really only need to get 3 stamps because the first stamp is stamped already and you've watched this, so you already have 2 stamps. So now you only have to do 2 more things. Okay. Another thing I did wrong when I was a student is I would attend workshops like this, but I wouldn't take any of the information away or really turn it into action. It would be another situation where I would take notes and I wouldn't look at them afterwards. And it's like, I'd come out and be like, that was an awesome workshop. And then, I wouldn't make any improvements. So I think it's important to just really consciously at this point, identify 1 or 2 new strategies that you're going to try. Write them down separately, maybe even tell somebody that you're going to try this new strategy, and just consciously work on implementing it this week and reflecting on whether it works for you and whether it doesn't. And, if there are any adjustments you need to make that will make it work better. This is a way that we keep, moving forward as students with our skills. So thank you for watching, and all the best with your studies.